Have you ever seen someone's entire world shatter in less than a second? 300 Navy SEALs sat frozen in absolute silence as a quiet female trainee they had all dismissed stood over a screaming man, his arm bent at an impossible angle. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody rushed to help him. Because in that moment, everyone realized the same terrifying truth. She was never the weakest person in that pit. She was the most dangerous. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories about quiet strength and hidden truth, consider subscribing. But first, let me take you back 11 weeks to when this all began. The sound came first. A sharp crack that echoed across the combat pit like a gunshot, cutting through the afternoon heat and silencing 300 voices at once. Then the scream followed, raw and guttural, the kind that makes your stomach drop, even if you have heard worse. In the center of the sand-filled arena, a man knelt clutching his arm, which now bent at an angle that made seasoned warriors look away. Standing 2 paces behind him, perfectly still, was a woman most of them had never bothered to learn the name of. Her breathing was steady. Her hands hung loose at her sides. She did not look surprised. She did not look afraid. She looked like someone who had done this before. To understand how it came to this, you have to go back 11 weeks. Back to when the California coastline was still unfamiliar and the faces in the barracks were still nameless. Back to when Rivers Galloway first arrived at the basic underwater demolition/SEAL training facility and became, almost immediately, invisible. It was dawn when the new class of trainees hit the beach for the first time. 47 bodies in matching gear, all of them exhausted before the sun even cleared the horizon. They carried logs above their heads, ran through surf that wanted to drag them under, and learned what it felt like to have sand in places sand should never reach. Among them was Rivers, lean and unremarkable in build, moving with an economy that did not draw attention. She was never first. She was never last. She existed in the middle of every formation, blending into the mass of bodies like she had been designed for it. Chief Harlow stood on the ridge above the beach, binoculars pressed to his face, watching the class struggle through another set of log lifts. He panned across the line slowly, pausing on the ones who looked ready to quit, the ones who pushed too hard too early, the ones who would not make it past Hell Week. Then his lens stopped on Rivers. He watched her for longer than he had watched anyone else. Her form was too clean, her breathing too controlled. She moved like someone who already knew how much energy each movement would cost, and had budgeted accordingly. Harlow lowered the binoculars, his expression unreadable, and made a note on the clipboard in his other hand. The mess hall at lunch was a cramped, fluorescent-lit space that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and reheated protein. Trainees sat shoulder to shoulder at long metal tables, shoveling food into their mouths with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing rest is measured in minutes. Rivers sat at the far end of one table, alone despite the crowding. She ate methodically, chewing each bite the same number of times, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Trainee Polk dropped into the seat across from her, his tray clattering against the table. He was the kind of guy who made friends easily, the one who could crack a joke even when his lungs were screaming. He grinned at Rivers through a mouthful of rice. "Where did you come from before this?" he asked. "Logistics," Rivers said. "Inventory management?" Polk laughed, nearly choking on his food. "Seriously? From counting bullets to shooting them?" Rivers did not smile. She just kept eating. Polk waited for her to say more, but when it became clear she would not, he shrugged and turned his attention back to his tray. Across the room, a louder group of trainees clustered around a broad-shouldered man with a thick neck and a voice that carried. His name was Krennic, but everyone called him Bulldog. It was not a compliment, but he wore it like one. He noticed Rivers sitting alone and nudged the guy next to him, a wiry trainee named Vetch. "Who is the ghost?" Bulldog said, loud enough that half the room could hear. Vetch glanced over. "Galloway. Keeps to herself. Weird energy?" Bulldog smirked. "Probably diversity quota. She will not last." Rivers did not react. She finished her meal, stood, and carried her tray to the wash station. As she passed Bulldog's table, he watched her with the kind of interest a predator gives, prey it has not decided to chase yet. She felt his eyes on her, but did not turn. When she pushed through the double doors and into the blinding sunlight outside, she rolled her left sleeve down over a pattern of scars on her forearm. They were geometric, surgical, deliberate. Not the kind you got by accident. The combat conditioning course was a gauntlet of obstacles designed to break bodies and egos in equal measure. Walls too high to climb without help. Ropes that shredded hands. Mud pits that swallowed boots and tested whether you would rather drown or keep moving. The instructors did not care which trainees finished first. They cared who helped others finish and who stepped over them. Bulldog was loud on the course, the kind of loud that filled space and demanded attention. He barked encouragement at his crew, slapped backs, made himself the center of every moment. When trainee Loomis, a younger recruit with legs too long for his frame, stumbled coming off the cargo net, Bulldog was there, not to help, to make an example. He shoulder-checked Loomis hard enough to send him sprawling into the mud. "Stay down if you cannot keep up, Boot." Loomis did not respond. He was too exhausted, his chest heaving as he tried to push himself upright. A few trainees hesitated, glancing between Loomis and Bulldog, but none of them moved to help. The instructors watched from their positions along the course, clipboards in hand, taking notes. Rivers was halfway up the rope climb when it happened. She paused, one hand gripping the knot above her, and looked down at the scene below. Her face showed nothing, no anger, no sympathy, just observation. Then she continued climbing. Chief Harlow stood near the finish line, arms crossed. He was not watching Bulldog. He was watching Rivers watch Bulldog. When she reached the top of the rope and rang the bell, Harlow made another note. That night, the barracks were dim and close, filled with the sounds of grown men trying to sleep through pain. Bulldog's crew had claimed the bunks near the center of the room, a territory marked by volume and presence. Vetch lounged on his bunk, boots still on, flipping through a magazine he had smuggled in. "Galloway is weird, man," he said to no one in particular. "Does not talk, does not bond, just watches." Bulldog sat up, elbows on his knees. "She is dead weight. Probably diversity quota. She will not last past Hell Week." 3 bunks away, Rivers lay on her side, back turned to the rest of the room. She was not asleep. She listened to every word, cataloging voices, noting patterns. In her hand, hidden beneath her pillow, was a small notebook. The pages were filled with names, timestamps, observations. Not the kind of notes a trainee would keep. These were operational, clinical. At the top of the current page, partially obscured by her thumb, were 2 lines of text printed in block letters. Classification level, :TS/SCI. Operation: Stillwater. She added a new entry in tight, precise handwriting. Krennic. Patterns consistent. Escalation likely. Then she closed the notebook and tucked it back under the pillow. Sleep did not come easily, but she had learned long ago how to function without it. Morning formation came early, as it always did. The entire class stood in ranks on the grinder, a wide concrete pad that radiated heat even in the pre-dawn cold. Chief Harlow stood before them, hands clasped behind his back, his voice carrying across the silent formation. "Gentlemen," he said, then paused. "And Galloway. This is evaluation week. Senior Command will be observing live combat drills. Your performance here determines whether you continue or you are sent home. This afternoon, close quarters combat demonstration, open air pit, full house, do not embarrass me." A ripple of tension moved through the ranks. Evaluation week meant eyes, officers, senior enlisted, people whose opinions mattered, people who decided futures. Rivers felt her jaw tighten, just barely, a micro-expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Across the formation, Bulldog stood a little straighter, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. This was his kind of stage. Chief Harlow's eyes swept across the formation and, for just a moment, they landed on Rivers. There was something in his gaze that did not belong, not disapproval, not encouragement. Something closer to concern. Or warning. Then he dismissed the class and turned on his heel, walking back toward the command building. The hours before the demonstration crawled by. Trainees moved through the day's training with distracted focus, their minds already in the pit, imagining the crowd, rehearsing movements. Rivers did not rehearse. She went through her drills with the same measured efficiency she always did, conserving energy, staying invisible. But just before dawn, before the rest of the barracks woke, she had been alone on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. She moved through a sequence there, fluid and precise, a series of strikes and counters that did not belong to any manual the Navy published. These were older techniques, refined by necessity, learned in places where mistakes were measured in body counts. Her breathing never hitched, her balance never wavered. When she finished, she stood at the edge of the cliff and stared out at the water, watching the waves break against the rocks below. Then she turned and walked back toward the barracks, her face as empty as the sky. The combat pit was an open-air arena carved into the training grounds, a wide circle of sand surrounded by aluminum bleachers that rose in steep tiers. By the time the afternoon demonstration began, those bleachers were packed. Nearly 300 Navy SEALs filled the seats, some active duty, some senior officers observing for evaluation purposes, all of them watching with the kind of focus that comes from lives spent in violent places. The air smelled like salt water and sweat. The sun beat down without mercy. The trainees stood in a nervous line along the edge of the pit, their backs to the bleachers, facing the sand. Rivers stood at the far end, hands loose at her sides, her breathing slow and steady. Bulldog was near the center, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, his energy crackling like static. He looked ready. He looked hungry. Lead Instructor Machen stood in the middle of the pit, a compact man in his 40s with the kind of scars that told stories he would never repeat. He had been DevGru before this, part of the Navy's most elite unit, and he carried himself like someone who had nothing left to prove. His voice, when he spoke, did not need to be loud to command attention. "We need 2 volunteers for the counter-assault demonstration. Let's see who has the spine for it." Bulldog's hand shot up before Machen finished the sentence. "I will go, Chief." Machen nodded. "Good. Pick your partner." Bulldog scanned the line of trainees, his grin widening. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, until they landed on Rivers. The grin became something sharper. "I will take Galloway," he said, loud enough for the first few rows of the bleachers to hear. "Let's see if logistics prepared her for this." Laughter rippled through some of the trainees. A few exchanged glances. Others stayed silent, their discomfort visible. Rivers did not react. She stepped forward, moving into the pit with the same measured calm she brought to everything else. Bulldog followed, rolling his shoulders, playing to the crowd. In the stands, high up in the officer section, a man in dress whites leaned toward Chief Harlow. The man wore a single star on his collar, Admiral Cross. His voice was low, meant only for Harlow's ears. "Is that her?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Harlow said. His jaw was tight. "She is not supposed to be exposed yet." "I know." Admiral Cross leaned back, his expression unreadable. He did not take his eyes off Rivers. In the center of the pit, Machen addressed the 2 volunteers. "Attacker closes distance, defender counters and controls. This is about technique, not strength. Do you both understand?" Bulldog nodded, still grinning. Rivers said nothing. Machen looked at her for a long moment, then stepped back, giving them space. Bulldog moved first. He stepped closer to Rivers, crowding her, his voice dropping just low enough that only she and the first few rows could hear. "You do not belong here. Everyone knows it. You are dead weight for the teams." Rivers said nothing. Her eyes were flat, empty. Bulldog mistook the silence for fear. He stepped closer still, his chest almost touching hers, his voice rising now, playing for the audience. "When we deploy, people like you get real operators killed. Still nothing. No reaction, no fear, no anger. Just that same hollow stare." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some of them were starting to realize this was not part of the drill. In the stands, Chief Harlow stood abruptly and began moving toward the edge of the pit. He was too far away. He would not make it in time. Bulldog stepped into Rivers' space one last time, close enough that she could smell the salt on his skin. "Say something, Boot, or are you going to cry?" Rivers' breathing did not change. Her posture did not shift. Bulldog raised his fist. Not a drill move, not a demonstration, a real punch aimed at her face, intended to connect. The crowd inhaled collectively. Time seemed to slow. Rivers' eyes tracked the trajectory of his fist. Her weight shifted almost imperceptibly, her rear foot pivoting. Her left hand moved, intercepting his wrist mid-swing, her grip locking around it like a vice. Her right hand clamped onto his elbow. She rotated her hips, generating torque, applying pressure against the joint's natural axis. The mechanics were textbook, military combatives. Krav Maga lineage, refined by years of repetition in places where hesitation meant death. The crack was sharp and clean, the sound of bone breaking in exactly the way it was designed to, under controlled force. It echoed across the pit like a gunshot. Bulldog's scream followed immediately, guttural and raw, the kind of sound that bypasses thought and goes straight to instinct. He dropped to his knees, his arm hanging at an unnatural angle, and the scream did not stop. Rivers released him and stepped back. Exactly 2 paces. Her hands returned to her sides. Her breathing was still controlled, still steady. She did not look at Bulldog writhing in the sand. She looked at the stands. 300 people sat in total silence. No cheering, no gasping. Just the weight of collective realization settling over them like a heavy blanket. Medical staff sprinted into the pit, their boots kicking up sand, their voices sharp with urgency. Compound fracture. Elbow is completely destroyed. Get the stretcher, now. Rivers stood alone in the center of the pit, untouched, waiting. Instructor Makan approached her slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a weapon they were not sure was still loaded. "You want to tell me what that was?" he said. Rivers did not answer. From the stands, Admiral Cross rose to his feet. The crowd parted as he descended the bleachers, every eye following him. He walked to the edge of the pit and stopped, looking directly at Rivers. The silence deepened, became absolute. "Trainee Galloway," Admiral Cross said. His voice carried across the entire arena. Rivers stiffened slightly. It was the first visible emotion she had shown. "Or should I use your actual designation?" Cross continued. The silence became something physical, pressing down on every person present. Cipher. The reaction was immediate. Heads whipped around in the stands. Whispers erupted like wildfire, spreading through the bleachers in waves. Wait, what? Did he just say Cipher? That's Cipher, the contract operator, the one from Jordan. There is no way. Chief Harlow, still halfway down the bleacher steps, stopped moving. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. On the ground, Bulldog looked up at Rivers through tears of pain, his face twisted in horror and disbelief. Rivers met Admiral Cross's gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The whispers grew louder, the crowd trying to process what they had just heard, trying to reconcile the quiet woman they had ignored for 11 weeks, with a name that existed only in classified briefings and rumors passed between operators who had seen too much. If you have ever felt invisible, or underestimated, or dismissed by people who should have known better, share that story in the comments. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already survived everything the loud ones are still afraid of. Admiral Cross stood at the edge of the combat pit, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his face carved from stone. The whispers in the stands had not stopped. They rolled through the bleachers like a wave that kept building, but never broke. Cipher. The name hung in the air, heavy and sharp, a word that carried weight in rooms most of these men would never enter. Rivers stood in the center of the sand, her posture unchanged, her breathing still controlled. She did not look away from the Admiral. She did not apologize. She waited. Cross descended the final steps, into the pit, his boots sinking slightly into the sand. Medical personnel worked frantically around Bulldog, strapping his arm, preparing to move him. His screams had become whimpers, punctuated by gasps that sounded like drowning. Cross did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Rivers. "For those who do not know," Cross said, his voice pitched to carry across the entire arena, "and most of you should not know, Cipher is a Tier 1 contracted operator. She has trained counter-terrorism units in Jordan, Israel, and Colombia. She has been in more gunfights than half the men in these stands." The whispers stopped. The silence that replaced them was different now, heavier, more aware. Cross let it settle before continuing. "She holds certifications in advanced combatives, hostage rescue, and covert reconnaissance. Her record is sealed at levels most of you will never be cleared for. And for the past 11 weeks, she has been here, in this program, under deep cover, conducting an internal investigation." The faces in the stands shifted through a spectrum of reactions: disbelief, embarrassment, slowly dawning respect. In the third row, Trainee Polk sat with his mouth open, his hands gripping the bench in front of him. "Holy God," he whispered to no one. We have been running drills next to a living weapon. Instructor Machen stood off to the side, his arms crossed, his jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. He stared at Rivers with an expression that was part anger, part grudging admiration. She was not trying to graduate, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. She was auditing us. In the upper section of the bleachers, tucked among the crowd, 3 men sat frozen, Vetch and 2 others from Bulldog's crew. Their faces had gone pale, sweat beading on their foreheads despite the shade. Vetch glanced at the exits, calculating distance, weighing options. One of the others, a stocky trainee named Durrell, leaned close. "We need to move," Durrell whispered. Before Vetch could respond, 2 figures in different uniforms appeared at the end of their row. Military police. They did not speak. They just stood there, hands resting on their belts, eyes locked on the 3 men. Vetch turned back to face the pit, his hands trembling. Rivers still had not moved. Admiral Cross stepped closer, close enough that his next words were meant only for her, though the silence in the arena was so complete that the front rows caught fragments. "You were supposed to stay invisible," Cross said. "I was," Rivers replied. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Until he made that impossible." Cross studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, just once, and turned to address Instructor Machen. "Chief, secure the area. I want a full debrief in 30 minutes. No one leaves this facility until I clear them." Machen snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." Cross looked back at Rivers. "You are coming with me." She followed him out of the pit without a word. The crowd watched them go. The silence, breaking only when they disappeared through the gate at the far end. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, a flood of speculation and disbelief. The medical team lifted Bulldog onto a stretcher, his face gray with shock, his eyes glassy. As they carried him past the bleachers, he turned his head and looked back at the pit, at the place where Rivers had stood. His expression was pure horror. The secure briefing room was located in the administrative building, a low concrete structure that looked like it had been designed to withstand a siege. The room itself was small and windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent panels that made everyone look sick. A long metal table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs that had seen better decades. Admiral Cross sat at the head of the table. Chief Harlow sat to his right, his face drawn and tired. 2 men in dark suits sat across from them, badges clipped to their belts. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Rivers stood at the far end of the table, her hands clasped behind her back, at ease but not relaxed. On the table between them lay a series of manila folders, each one thick with documents. Photographs spilled from the edges. Incident reports, witness statements, timelines. One of the NCIS agents, a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a scar across his knuckles, tapped the top folder. 3 training deaths in 18 months, he said. All ruled accidental, all involved trainees who had reported harassment by the same peer group prior to their deaths. Rivers reached forward and opened the top folder. Inside were photographs of 3 young men in dress uniforms, their faces frozen in official portraits that would be sent to families. Beneath each photo was a name, a date, and a summary of how they died. Drowning during a night swim. Heat stroke during a conditioning run. Training accident involving a faulty rappel line. Rivers spread the photos across the table like cards in a hand. Trainee First Class Marcus Yeldrin, she said, tapping the first photo. 22 years old. Reported being denied water access during Hell Week by members of Krennic's crew. Found unresponsive in his bunk 3 days later. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest, secondary to dehydration and exhaustion. She moved to the second photo. Trainee Jamal Okoro, 24. Filed a complaint about equipment sabotage 2 weeks before his death. His rappel harness failed during a cliffside drill. The investigation concluded it was a manufacturing defect. The third photo, trainee Ethan Paredes, 23. Documented multiple incidents of physical intimidation, drowned during a night navigation swim, no witnesses. The official report cited possible disorientation and panic. Rivers pulled another folder from the stack and opened it. Inside were surveillance photos, grainy but clear enough. Bulldog and his crew, huddled together in various locations around the base. Timestamps in the corners. She slid one photo. Forward. This was taken 4 days before Okoro's death. Krennic and Vetch in the equipment shed, alone, after hours. That shed is where the rappel gear is stored. Chief Harlow leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. Why was this not caught earlier? Because they were careful, Rivers said. They never acted alone. They rotated who was directly involved. They kept their circle tight and their alibis tighter. And they targeted trainees who were already struggling, who could be written off as weak or unable to handle the pressure. The second NCIS agent, a woman with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, opened her own folder. "We have been building a case for 3 months," she said. "But we needed someone on the inside, someone they would not suspect, someone who could observe without raising alarms." Rivers closed the folder in front of her. Krennic's crew operates on intimidation and loyalty. They protect each other. They cover tracks. But they also have patterns. Krennic always escalates before an incident. He tests boundaries, pushes harder each time. What happened in the pit today was not random. It was a test. Admiral Cross folded his hands. A test for what? To see if I would respond like a trained operator or stay in character as a struggling recruit, Rivers said. If I had not reacted, if I had let him hit me, he would have known I was not what I appeared to be. Operators do not freeze. We move. But if I stayed passive, he would have escalated further. And his next target was already chosen. Who? Harlow asked. Trainee Loomis, Rivers said. Krennic has been isolating him for 2 weeks. Verbal harassment, physical intimidation disguised as horseplay. Loomis is young, inexperienced, and already struggling with the physical demands. He fits the profile exactly. If I had not forced this situation today, Loomis would not have survived Hell Week. The room fell quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, the only sound. The NCIS agent with the scar tapped his pen against the table. "So, you broke your cover to prevent another death," he said. "I broke my cover because the mission required it," Rivers replied. "My orders were to observe and report, but those orders also included preventing loss of life where possible. I made a tactical decision in the moment. I stand by it." Admiral Cross leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "The broken arm just burned your operation." "The broken arm just closed it," Rivers said. "Krennic is done. His crew will fold under interrogation. You have enough evidence now to bring charges. The mission was always going to end with exposure. It just happened 11 weeks in instead of 12. Cross studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You made the right call, Cypher." Rivers did not react to the praise. She simply waited. Harlow cleared his throat. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we process arrests," Cross said. Krennic, Vetch, Durrell, and one other, whose name was already flagged, they will be taken into custody within the hour. The rest of the class will be debriefed and cleared, and Operator Galloway will be reassigned. Rivers looked at him. "Where?" Cross smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Wherever the quiet ones are." The next morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that felt more like an ending than a beginning. The remaining trainees assembled on the grinder in silence, their breath misting in the air. They stood in ranks, but the formation felt different now. Looser, uncertain. 4 of their number were gone, taken in the night by MPs who had not bothered with explanations. Rumors had filled the void, wild and contradictory, but the truth was still classified. Admiral Cross stood before them in his dress whites, his hands clasped behind his back. Chief Harlow stood beside him, his face unreadable. Rivers stood off to the side, still in trainee gear, her duffel bag at her feet. She did not look at the formation. She looked past it, toward the ocean beyond the base perimeter. "Some of you feel deceived," Cross began. His voice was firm, but not unkind. "I understand that. You trained alongside someone you believed was one of you, and it turns out she was not. That feels like betrayal. But let me be clear about something." He paused, letting the words settle. Operator Galloway's mission saved lives. It exposed a network of criminal behavior that was rotting this program from the inside. 3 men are dead because we did not catch it sooner. How many more would have died if she had not been here? No one answered. The trainees shifted uncomfortably, avoiding each other's eyes. "The standard you are being held to," Cross continued, "is not about who is the loudest or the toughest. It is not about who can intimidate their peers or who can survive by stepping on others. The standard is about who shows up, does the work, and protects the team. Operator Galloway met that standard long before she ever set foot on this base. He turned toward Rivers. She straightened slightly but did not come to attention. "Cipher," Cross said, using the call sign deliberately. "Spent years in places most of you will never deploy to. She trained foreign special operations units. She conducted missions that will never be declassified. And she did all of that while maintaining a level of operational security that kept her alive in environments where one mistake meant death." He extended his hand toward her. Rivers stepped forward and took it. The handshake was brief, firm, professional. When she released his hand and stepped back, Cross addressed the formation again. "She was never your competition. She was your guardian. Remember that." The trainees stood in silence. Then, slowly, one by one, they came to attention. It was not a salute. It was something else. Recognition, respect. The kind that is earned, not given. Rivers did not acknowledge it. She picked up her duffel bag, slung it over one shoulder, and turned toward the gate. Trainee Polk broke from the formation and jogged after her. He caught up just as she reached the edge of the grinder. "Hey," he called. She stopped but did not turn around. "Cipher," he said, then corrected himself. "Rivers. Or whatever I am supposed to call you." She looked back at him. Polk shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. "Thank you," he said, "for Loomis and for the others. We did not know. We should have, but we did not." Rivers nodded once. "You know now?" Polk hesitated, then asked the question that had been eating at him since the previous afternoon. "Did you really do logistics before this?" Rivers almost smiled. "Almost. Among other things," she said. Polk watched her walk away, her figure shrinking as she moved toward the parking area where a black SUV waited. Chief Harlow stood beside the vehicle, his arms crossed. When Rivers reached him, he pushed off the door and opened it for her. "Where to next?" he asked. "Wherever the quiet ones are," she said. She climbed into the SUV. Harlow closed the door and stepped back. The vehicle pulled away, disappearing down the access road that led off the base. Harlow stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle before finally turning and walking back toward the command building. In the secure wing of the base medical facility, Bulldog lay in a hospital bed, his arm immobilized in a complex brace that looked more like scaffolding than a cast. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from pain and medication. An MP stood outside his door. Another sat in a chair by the window. They were not there for his protection. A doctor entered, a Navy captain with gray at his temples and the kind of calm that comes from seeing too much. He checked the chart at the foot of the bed without looking at Bulldog. "You will need surgery," the doctor said. "Multiple pins, possibly a joint replacement down the line. Your career as a SEAL is over before it started." Bulldog did not respond. He stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched. "You are also under investigation for 3 counts of negligent homicide, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice," the doctor continued. "The NCIS agents outside will be taking you into custody as soon as you are stable for transport." Bulldog closed his eyes. The doctor hung the chart back on its hook and left without another word. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitor beside the bed. Bulldog opened his eyes again and stared at his immobilized arm. He thought about the pit, about Rivers standing over him, her face empty, her breathing controlled. He thought about the crack of his bone breaking and the way she had stepped back, as calm as if she had just tied her shoes. She had not been angry. She had not been scared. She had just been efficient. That was what terrified him most. The realization that to her, breaking his arm had been a calculation, not an emotion, a problem solved, a threat neutralized, nothing personal, nothing heated, just work. In another part of the base, in a barracks that now felt too empty, the remaining trainees sat on their bunks in the dim evening light. No one spoke. Polk sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Across from him, another trainee named Cosbar finally broke the silence. "Do you think she knew the whole time?" he asked. "About all of it?" Polk nodded slowly. She was watching, the whole time, every interaction, every moment Bulldog went after someone. She was taking notes. Caspar shook his head. "And we just thought she was weird. We thought she was weak," Polk corrected. "We thought she did not belong." The words hung in the air. Another trainee, older and quieter than the rest, spoke from his bunk in the corner. His name was Teague, and he had deployed twice before attempting SEAL training. "You know what the scariest part is?" Teague said. "She could have stopped at any time, any of it. She could have put Bulldog down the first week, but she waited, she watched, she let it play out until she had everything she needed." "Why?" Casper asked. "Because that is what operators do," Teague said. "They do not react, they calculate. They wait for the exact right moment, and then they move. And when they move, it is over." Polk thought about that. About Rivers in the pit, her hand intercepting Bulldog's fist mid-swing, the mechanical precision of the break. About her face, empty of emotion, just focused and calm. He thought about all the times he had seen her on the beach, in the mess hall, on the obstacle course. Always alone, always watching, always there. "She was never one of us," he said quietly. "No," Teague agreed. "She was something else entirely." The days that followed were strange and muted. The base felt smaller without Bulldog's crew. The remaining trainees moved through their training with a new awareness, a caution that had not been there before. They watched each other differently, spoke differently. The casual cruelty that had been part of the culture, the hazing disguised as tradition. It all felt heavier now, dangerous in a way it had not seemed before. Chief Harlow conducted the training with his usual intensity, but there was something different in his eyes, a weariness. He watched the trainees more carefully now, looking for the patterns Rivers had seen, the small cruelties that could grow into something worse. During a break in the obstacle course, he pulled Polk aside. "You asked Galloway where she came from," Harlow said. "It was not a question." Polk nodded. "She said logistics." Harlow almost smiled. She was not lying. She did work in logistics. For 6 months, 15 years ago, before she became something else. "What did she become?" Polk asked. Harlow looked out toward the ocean, toward the cliffs where Rivers had stood alone in the early mornings, running through sequences no one was supposed to see. "A solution," Harlow said, "to problems most people do not know exist." He walked away before Polk could ask anything else. That night, Polk lay in his bunk and thought about Rivers, about the scars on her forearm, about the way she moved, efficient and controlled, like every motion had been practiced 1,000 times, about the notebook she kept hidden under her pillow. He wondered where she was now, what problem she was solving, whose life she was quietly saving while staying invisible. In a nondescript office building 3 states away, Rivers sat across a desk from a man in civilian clothes. The office had no windows, no nameplate on the door. The man pushed a folder across the desk toward her. She opened it and scanned the contents. Photographs, maps, dossiers. "Eastern Europe," the man said. "A training program that has lost 4 recruits in 6 months. All accidental, all questionable." Rivers closed the folder. "Timeline? You leave in 48 hours." She stood, picked up the folder, and turned toward the door. The man called after her. "Good work at Coronado," he said. Rivers paused at the door but did not turn around. "It was not finished," she said. 3 men are already dead." "But you stopped it from being 6, the man replied. Rivers opened the door and walked out without responding. The hallway beyond was empty and fluorescent lit, identical to 1,000 other hallways in 1,000 other buildings where people made decisions that never made the news. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. When the doors opened, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the elevator descended, she pulled out a small notebook from her jacket pocket, the same one she had kept under her pillow in the barracks. She flipped to a blank page and wrote a single word at the top: Stillwater. Then beneath it, in smaller letters, she wrote, "Closed." She closed the notebook and put it away. The elevator doors opened. She walked out into the gray afternoon light and climbed into a waiting car. The driver did not ask where she was going. He already knew. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic. Just another vehicle in a city full of them. Invisible. Exactly as intended. Back at Coronado, the sun set over the ocean in streaks of red and gold. The remaining trainees stood in formation for evening muster, their faces turned toward Chief Harlow. He read off the schedule for the next day, the same as he always did, his voice steady and firm. But when he dismissed them, he added something else. "Remember why you are here," he said. "Not to prove you are the toughest, not to break the person next to you. You are here to become part of a team that protects people who cannot protect themselves. If you forget that, you do not belong here." The trainees dispersed in silence. Polk walked back toward the barracks, his hands in his pockets, his mind still turning over everything that had happened. He thought about Rivers standing in the pit, calm and deadly. He thought about the way the entire base had gone silent when Admiral Cross said her call sign. He thought about the 3 men who had died before anyone realized what was happening, and he thought about the fact that somewhere out there, right now, Rivers was doing it again, watching, waiting, staying invisible until the exact moment she needed to move, protecting people who would never know her name. If you have ever met someone who worked in silence, who never asked for credit, who carried weight no one else could see, leave a comment. The world needs more people like that. And if this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one. Stories about the people who do the hard things when no one is watching. The secure briefing room had felt like a tomb, airless and cold. But when Rivers walked out into the California afternoon, the world felt different, lighter. The weight of 11 weeks carrying a false identity had lifted, replaced by something else. Not relief. She did not allow herself relief, but acknowledgement. The mission had concluded. The target was neutralized. 3 deaths could not be undone, but the 4th, 5th, and 6th had been prevented. In her line of work, that counted as a win. She walked across the grinder toward the barracks to collect the few personal items she had been allowed to keep. The space was empty now, the other trainees still in formation, receiving their debrief from Admiral Cross. Her bunk looked the same as it had that morning, sparse, impersonal. She pulled the small notebook from beneath the pillow and slipped it into her jacket pocket. There was nothing else worth taking. Everything she had brought was either government issue or part of the cover. Rivers Galloway, logistics specialist turned SEAL trainee, had never really existed. She had been a construct, a mask, and now the mask was coming off. She slung her duffel over one shoulder and walked toward the door. As she passed the row of bunks where Bulldog's crew had slept, she paused. Their spaces had already been stripped, mattresses bare, lockers emptied. It was as if they had never been there at all. Rivers knew that feeling. She had erased herself from places before, left no trace, moved on to the next mission without looking back. But this time felt different. This time, people knew her name, her real name, and that complicated things in ways she had not anticipated. The sound of boots on concrete made her turn. Chief Harlow stood in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun. He did not enter, just stood there, arms crossed, watching her. "You did not have to do it that way," he said. "Yes, I did," Rivers replied. If I had pulled him aside quietly, if I had de-escalated, he would have known, and the investigation would have collapsed. Harlow nodded slowly. He had read the mission brief. He knew the parameters. But knowing and accepting were different things. "You broke a man's arm in front of 300 people," he said. "That is going to follow you." "It already does," Rivers said. This just added one more. She walked past him into the sunlight. Harlow turned and followed, keeping pace beside her. As she headed toward the administration building, the afternoon heat pressed down on them, the kind of dry California warmth that made everything feel distant and hazy. "Where do they have you going next?" he asked. "Eastern Europe," she said. "Another training program, another pattern." He stopped walking. She continued a few more steps before stopping as well, turning to face him. The space between them felt wider than the physical distance suggested. "How many times have you done this?" Harlow asked. "How many programs have you infiltrated?" Rivers did not answer immediately. She looked past him, toward the ocean, toward the cliffs where she had spent her mornings alone. The waves broke against the rocks in steady rhythm, the same as they had every day for 11 weeks, constant, predictable, unlike everything else. "Enough," she said finally. "And how many times has it ended like this?" "Never," Rivers said. "Usually I finish the investigation and disappear before anyone knows I was there. This was the first time I had to break cover in front of a crowd." Harlow studied her face, looking for something. Regret, maybe, or doubt. He did not find it. What he saw instead was a kind of emptiness. Not the emptiness of someone who felt nothing, but the emptiness of someone who had felt too much for too long and had learned to wall it off just to keep functioning. "Do you ever get tired of it?" he asked. The lying, the pretending. Rivers considered the question. It was a fair one. She had spent years being other people, other names, other histories. She had learned to slip into identities the way most people slipped into jackets. Easy, comfortable, temporary. But each one left a mark, a small erosion of whatever had been underneath to begin with. She was not sure anymore what was real and what was performance. The lines had blurred so completely that sometimes she caught herself responding to situations in ways that belonged to old covers, old missions, old versions of herself that no longer existed except as ghosts in her memory. Every day, she said, but tired does not mean stop. Harlow nodded. He understood that. Every operator understood that. You kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant carrying weight you could not afford. The machinery of war required momentum. Once you stopped, it became harder to start again. And some operators never did. For what it is worth, Harlow said, you did good work here. Real work. The kind that matters. Rivers met his eyes. She did not smile, but something in her expression softened slightly. That is all I ever wanted to do, she said quietly. Harlow extended his hand. She shook it, firm and brief. Good hunting, Cypher, he said. Rivers nodded once and turned away. She walked toward the black SUV waiting in the parking lot. The driver stood beside it, door already open. She climbed in without looking back. The door closed, the engine started, and just like that, she was gone. Harlow stood there for a long moment, watching the vehicle disappear down the access road, before finally turning and walking back toward the command building. Inside the administration building, Admiral Cross stood in front of a secure computer terminal, reviewing the after-action report that Rivers had filed earlier that morning. It was thorough, clinical, detailed. Every interaction with Bulldog and his crew documented, every piece of evidence cataloged, every decision justified with operational logic. It read like a textbook example of deep cover intelligence work. But between the lines, Cross could see something else. The cost, the isolation, the constant performance. Rivers had spent 11 weeks surrounded by people and had been utterly alone the entire time. That took a toll. He had seen it before in other operators, the ones who stayed under too long, the ones who forgot how to be themselves because they had been someone else for so long. He closed the report and leaned back in his chair, removing his reading glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. The weight of command sat heavily on him today. 3 young men were dead because the system had failed to catch the pattern early enough. That failure belonged to everyone in the chain, including him. Rivers had done her part. She had identified the threat, documented the evidence, and prevented further casualties. But prevention did not bring back the dead. It never did. His aide, a young lieutenant commander named Strauss, knocked and entered. "Sir," he said, "the MPs have Krennic and his crew in custody. NCIS is starting interrogations within the hour. They are expecting full confessions by tomorrow." "Good," Cross said. "What about the rest of the class?" "Debriefed and cleared. Chief Harlow is keeping them on a tight schedule. He thinks structure will help them process what happened." Cross nodded. He thought about the faces in the stands the previous afternoon, the shock, the disbelief, the slow realization that they had been training alongside someone who operated on a completely different level. It would change them. Some for the better. They would learn the lesson Rivers had inadvertently taught. That strength was not about dominance. That real operators protected their teams, they did not tear them apart. But others would wash out, unable to reconcile what they thought they knew with what they had learned. That was fine. Better to lose them now than in the field where their failures would cost lives. "What about Galloway?" Strauss asked. "Where is she being reassigned?" Cross looked at the closed report on his screen. The cursor blinked in the silence. "Somewhere she can do the most good," he said. "Somewhere the quiet ones are." Strauss did not ask for clarification. He knew better. Some missions stayed classified long after they ended. Some operators disappeared into the machinery of national security and were never spoken of again. Cypher was one of those. A name in a file. A legend in whispered conversations. A solution to problems that were never officially acknowledged. "Sir," Strauss said carefully, "may I speak freely?" Cross nodded. "What she did yesterday," Strauss continued, breaking that man's arm in front of everyone. That took courage, not just the physical act, but the willingness to sacrifice her cover for the mission. Most operators would have found another way, a quieter way. Cross leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. Most operators are not Cypher, he said. She does not think like most people. She thinks in terms of outcomes and acceptable losses. And she calculated that exposing herself was the only way to prevent the next death. She was right. But now everyone knows who she is, Strauss said. Does not that compromise future operations? Cross shook his head. They know a name, a call sign. They do not know her face in 6 months when she has different hair, different mannerisms, a different accent. They do not know her when she is someone else entirely. That is what makes her so effective. She does not just change her appearance. She becomes someone else at a fundamental level. And by the time this story spreads through the community, it will have been exaggerated so much that the real Cypher will be invisible again, hidden in plain sight by the legend that exceeds the reality. Strauss considered this. Do you think she will ever stop? He asked. Ever come in from the cold? Cross thought about the question. He had known operators like Rivers before, ghosts who moved through the world without attachment, without roots, without anything that tied them to a single identity or place. Some of them eventually burned out. The weight of all those false lives became too much, and they broke quietly, disappearing into civilian life and never speaking about what they had done. Others kept going until the work consumed them entirely, until there was nothing left but the mission. He was not sure which category Rivers fell into. Maybe neither. Maybe she was something else entirely. I do not know, Cross said honestly. I hope so. Everyone deserves a chance to be themselves eventually. But I am not sure she knows who that is anymore. The conversation ended there. Strauss left to attend to other duties. Cross turned back to his terminal and began drafting his own report to the higher levels of command. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, translating the messy reality of human behavior into the clean language of military documentation. Threat identified, target neutralized, mission accomplished. Recommend continued operational deployment for asset Cypher. He paused before hitting send, looking at the words on the screen. They were accurate but incomplete. They captured the facts, but not the truth. The truth was that Rivers had sacrificed a piece of herself in that pit yesterday. She had given up the invisibility she relied on to survive, and she had done it to save people she barely knew. That was the part that did not fit into official reports, the part that made her more than just an asset, the part that made her human. He sent the report and closed the terminal. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the training facility that stretched toward the ocean. Somewhere out there, a new class would arrive in a few weeks. Fresh faces, new names, all of them believing they were ready for what came next. And maybe some of them were, but none of them would know that. For 11 weeks they had shared this space with a legend, and that was exactly how it needed to be. In the base medical facility, the NCIS agent sat across from Bulldog in a sterile interview room. His arm was still immobilized, his face pale and drawn. The pain medication had dulled the sharp edges of his agony, but it had also stripped away his defenses. He looked smaller now, diminished. The aggressive confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by something hollow. The lead agent, the one with the scar across his knuckles, placed a folder on the table between them and opened it. Inside were photographs: Marcus Yeldrin, Jamal Okoro, Ethan Paredes. 3 young men who would never go home. The agent arranged them in a neat row, each face staring up at Bulldog from frozen moments in time. "We know what you did," the agent said. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "We have the evidence. We have the testimony. We have the surveillance footage. The only question now is whether you cooperate or whether you go down alone." Bulldog stared at the photographs. He had known their names, had eaten meals with them, had watched them struggle and fail and eventually die. He had told himself it was not his fault, that they were weak, that they did not belong, that the program was better off without them. He had told himself a lot of things. But sitting in this room, looking at their faces frozen in official portraits, he could not make himself believe any of it anymore. It was supposed to toughen them up, he said quietly. That is what Vetch said, that we were helping them, making them stronger. The agent leaned forward. By withholding water? By sabotaging their equipment? By isolating them until they broke? Bulldog did not answer. His throat had closed up, words trapped behind a wall of shame and denial that was finally crumbling. The agent slid another photograph across the table. This one showed Loomis, alive and current, sitting in a classroom during a training brief. His face was young, earnest, full of the kind of determination that came from not yet understanding how close he had come to dying. "This was going to be your next one," the agent said. "Trainee Loomis, young, struggling, isolated. You were already setting it up, and if Cypher had not been there, he would be dead in a month." Bulldog closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the pit, saw Rivers standing there, calm and empty, saw his own fist moving toward her face, saw her hand intercept it with mechanical precision, felt the moment his elbow broke, the sound and the pain arriving in the same instant. She had not hesitated, had not warned him, had just moved. And in that movement, she had ended everything: his career, his future, his carefully constructed self-image as someone strong and capable. All of it shattered in less than a second. The agent let the silence stretch, let the weight of it press down. Finally, Bulldog opened his eyes again and looked at the agent. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," the agent said, "from the beginning." And Bulldog started talking. It took hours. He detailed every incident, every name, every decision. He implicated Vetch and Durrell and the others. He walked the agents through the entire network, the culture of cruelty that had grown unchecked, the unspoken rules that let it continue. He described how it had started small, a little extra hazing here, a bit of rougher treatment there, nothing that seemed serious at first, but it had escalated. Each success emboldened them. Each trainee who quit or failed gave them confidence that they were doing something right, that they were making the program stronger by weeding out weakness. But weakness was not what they had been targeting. They had been targeting vulnerability. They had found the trainees who had no support system, no advocates, no one watching out for them. And they had systematically broken them. Marcus had been the first to die. They had denied him water during a heat exercise, telling themselves it was just toughening him up. When he collapsed, they had assumed he would recover. When he did not, they had told themselves it was not their fault, that he had been weak, that if he could not handle a little dehydration, he would never have made it as a SEAL anyway. Jamal had been different. He had been stronger, more resilient. So they had escalated. They had tampered with his equipment, not enough to be obvious, but enough to create failures at critical moments. The rappel harness had been Vetch's idea. A few strategic cuts in places that would not be visible during inspection, but would give way under stress. When Jamal fell, they had been shocked at how final it was, how permanent. But again, they had convinced themselves it was not murder. It was just an accident, bad luck, the kind of thing that happened in training. Ethan had been the breaking point, though they had not realized it at the time. He had been so obviously targeted, so clearly isolated and tormented, that it should have been impossible to miss. But the system had failed him. The instructors had been too busy. The other trainees had been too focused on their own survival. And Bulldog's crew had grown confident enough to be blatant. They had told Ethan he was worthless, that he would get people killed in the field, that he should quit before he embarrassed himself further. And when he went out for that night swim, alone and unsupported, they had known he was not coming back. They had just convinced themselves they were not responsible. By the time Bulldog finished talking, the sun had set and the room had grown cold. The agent closed his notebook and stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You will be charged with 3 counts of negligent homicide, conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming," the agent said. "You are looking at 20 years minimum, maybe more." Bulldog nodded. He had known it was coming. The numbers felt abstract, meaningless. 20 years was a concept, not a reality. Not yet. Right now, all he could think about was Rivers in the pit, the way she had moved, the way she had looked at him afterward, not with anger or satisfaction, just with nothing. Like he was not worth the energy of an emotional response. Like he was already forgotten. The agent left. The MPs came and escorted Bulldog back to his cell. He lay on the narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, his arm throbbing despite the medication. The pain was constant, a reminder of the moment his entire life had changed. He wondered if Rivers ever thought about him. Probably not. She had already moved on, already disappeared into whatever came next. He was just a name in a file now, a case closed, a mission completed. In another part of the base, in the barracks that now felt too empty, The remaining trainees gathered in small groups, processing what had happened. The official debrief had given them facts, but not understanding. They knew Bulldog and his crew were gone. They knew Rivers had been an undercover operator. They knew 3 men had died before anyone realized there was a pattern, but knowing did not equal comprehending. The emotional weight of it all hung over them like fog. Trainee Polk sat on his bunk with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Across from him, Loomis sat against the wall, his arms wrapped around his knees, looking younger than his 22 years. Other trainees occupied the surrounding bunks, all of them quiet, all of them lost in their own thoughts. "Do you think she knew?" Loomis asked suddenly. His voice broke the silence like a stone through glass. "That I was next?" Polk looked up. "Yeah," he said. "I think she knew." Loomis nodded slowly, processing that information. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. "She saved my life." Polk did not disagree. The evidence was clear. Rivers had identified Loomis as the next target and had forced the situation in the pit to prevent the escalation. She had sacrificed her cover to save someone she barely knew. That was the part Polk could not stop thinking about. The calculated nature of it. She had weighed her mission against Loomis's life and chosen the life. That was not the decision of someone following orders. That was the decision of someone who cared about something more fundamental than operational success. Another trainee, Kaspar, spoke from his bunk in the corner. "Do you think they will cancel Hell Week after everything that happened?" "No," Trainee Teague said. He was older than the others, had deployed twice before attempting SEAL training, and his voice carried authority. "They will run it exactly as planned. Because the program did not fail. The people running it did. And the only way to prove the program still works is to continue." The room fell silent again. They all knew he was right. Hell Week would come, regardless of deaths, investigations, or revelations. The machinery of military training did not stop for individual tragedies. It adapted, evolved, continued. That was both its strength and its cruelty. "What do you think she is doing right now?" Kaspar asked. "Cypher, I mean." Polk thought about that. He remembered the way Rivers had packed her gear, efficient and emotionless. The way she had walked away without looking back, already moving toward the next mission, the next identity, the next problem that needed solving. Probably the same thing she was doing here, Polk said. Watching, waiting, protecting people who do not know they need protection. Teague nodded slowly. "That is what makes her dangerous," he said. "Not the physical skills, though those are clearly exceptional, but the patience, the ability to be invisible for weeks or months while gathering information. Most people cannot do that. Most people need to be seen, to be acknowledged. She does not." The conversation drifted after that, moving to other topics, but the weight of what they had learned remained. They had trained alongside a legend and never known it. They had dismissed her as weak or strange when she was actually the most capable person in the entire program. That realization was humbling and uncomfortable. It forced them to question their own assumptions about strength and competence, about what it meant to be a warrior. Later that night, after lights out, Polk lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. Sleep would not come. His mind kept replaying the scene in the pit. The crack of breaking bone, the way Bulldog had screamed, the way Rivers had stepped back, calm and controlled, like nothing significant had happened. And then Admiral Cross's voice, carrying across the entire arena. Cypher. The name had weight. History. It represented something larger than the quiet woman they had ignored for 11 weeks. Polk thought about the scars on her forearm, the geometric pattern he had glimpsed once in the mess hall. He wondered where they had come from. What mission or firefight had left those marks? He wondered how many other scars she carried that were not visible. The emotional ones. The ones that came from living multiple lives, none of them real, all of them necessary. He wondered if she ever got lonely, if she ever wanted to just be herself, whoever that was, without the weight of operational security and cover identities. Probably not, he decided. People like Rivers did not become legends by wanting normal lives. They became legends by accepting the cost of protection, by choosing to be the silent guardian, the watcher in the dark, the solution to problems that regular people never knew existed. He finally fell asleep sometime after midnight, his dreams filled with images of the pit and the sound of breaking bone echoing across sand. 3 days later, the remaining trainees stood in formation on the grinder for their final evaluation before Hell Week. The sun was high and brutal, the air shimmering with heat. Chief Harlow walked the line, inspecting uniforms, checking gear, looking each man in the eye. His inspection was thorough and impersonal, the same as it had always been. But when he reached trainee Polk, he paused. "You have been quiet since the incident," Harlow said. Polk nodded. "Yes, Chief. Any particular reason?" Polk hesitated, then spoke carefully, aware that everyone could hear him. "I have been thinking about what I missed," he said, "about how we all missed it." Harlow waited, his expression neutral. "We thought she was weak because she was quiet," Polk continued. "We thought she did not belong because she did not act like us. And the whole time, she was the most capable person here." Harlow nodded slowly. "That is a lesson worth learning." "What else?" Polk met his eyes. "I have been thinking about the guys who died, about how we could have stopped it if we had paid attention, if we had cared more about the team than about looking tough." Harlow stepped back, addressing the entire formation now. His voice carried across the grinder, clear and firm. "That is the point. That is the entire point of this program. We are not building individuals. We are building teams. And teams protect each other. They do not tear each other down. If you cannot learn that, you do not belong here, no matter how fast you run or how much weight you can carry." He let the words settle, watching the faces in formation process what he was saying. Some of them got it immediately. Others would take time, but they would all remember this moment. They would all carry the weight of 3 deaths and the lesson Rivers had inadvertently taught them. "You are training to become part of the most elite combat force in the world," Harlow continued. "That means you will be called upon to do things most people cannot imagine. You will face enemies who want to kill you. You will operate in conditions that test every limit you have, and the only way you survive that is by trusting the person next to you, by protecting them the same way they protect you. If that trust breaks down, if you turn on each other, then you have already lost. The enemy does not need to defeat you. You have defeated yourselves." He dismissed the formation. The trainees dispersed, moving toward the obstacle course for the afternoon session. Polk walked beside Loomis, who had been unusually quiet since the incident. After a long silence, Loomis spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about what would have happened," he said. "If she had not been here." Polk glanced at him. "You would have died." Loomis nodded. "I know, and I would not have even known why. I would have thought it was my fault, that I was not strong enough or good enough. I would have died believing I deserved it." The words hung between them, heavy and true. That was the insidious nature of what Bulldog had built. He had made his victims believe they were responsible for their own torment, that they were failing some essential test of strength or character, when in reality they were just being targeted by someone who needed to hurt others to feel powerful. "She saw what was happening," Polk said, "and she stopped it. That is what real operators do. They protect people." They walked the rest of the way in silence, each of them carrying the weight of what had almost happened, what would have happened if Rivers had not been there. It was a strange kind of debt, owed to someone they would never see again, someone who had never asked for gratitude and would never receive it. But the debt existed nonetheless. A life saved, a future preserved, that meant something, even if it could never be repaid. 2 weeks later, in a rural training facility outside Bucharest, a new recruit arrived. She was quiet, unremarkable, blending into the background of a class that was already struggling through the 3rd week of selection. Her name, according to her paperwork, was Marin Codreanu. She spoke fluent Romanian with a slight Moldovan accent that suggested rural upbringing and limited formal education. Her background listed her as former military police with a logistics specialty, someone who had spent years managing inventory and supply chains before deciding to attempt special operations selection. She kept to herself, did not bond with the other recruits, did not struggle with the physical demands, but also did not excel. Just moved through the training with steady, controlled efficiency that kept her firmly in the middle of every ranking. The instructors noticed her the way Chief Harlow had noticed Rivers, not because she stood out, but because she was too perfect at not standing out. One of them, a colonel named Vasile, watched her through binoculars during a morning run. She moved with the kind of economy that came from years of practice, not the frantic energy of someone trying to prove themselves. Not the desperate flailing of someone barely keeping up. Just calm, measured progress. One foot in front of the other. Breathing controlled. Posture efficient. "Who is she?" Vasile asked his second in command, a major named Petrescu. "Codreanu," Petrescu replied, consulting a roster. "Came up through the enlisted ranks. Clean record. Nothing remarkable." Vasile lowered the binoculars. "Too clean," he said. "And nothing is ever unremarkable in our business." He made a note to watch her more closely, but he would not find anything. Because Rivers, now called Marin, had done this too many times. She knew how to be invisible, how to blend, how to become part of the background until the exact moment she needed to step forward. And somewhere in this facility, there was another bulldog, another network, another pattern. She could already see the edges of it. During meals in the communal dining hall, she observed the social hierarchies forming. There was always a dominant group, always someone who needed to assert control through intimidation. Here, it was a recruit named Ionescu, broad-shouldered, loud, aggressive in the way that suggested deep insecurity masked by violence. He had already claimed territory at the center table, surrounded by a crew of followers who laughed at his jokes and echoed his opinions. And he had already identified his targets, the weaker recruits, the ones who struggled with the physical demands or who did not fit the masculine ideal he had constructed in his mind. Rivers watched him isolate a young recruit named Dragomir during a rope climb exercise. The verbal harassment disguised as encouragement. The physical contact that was slightly too rough to be friendly. The way Ionescu's crew circled around whenever Dragomir was struggling, creating a wall of intimidation that prevented others from helping. It was familiar, the same pattern she had seen at Coronado, the same pattern she had seen in Jordan, in Colombia, in every military culture that confused dominance with leadership. She made mental notes, times, locations, interactions, the same methodical documentation she had performed before. At night, in the cramped barracks that smelled like diesel and old concrete, she transferred these observations into her notebook. The same notebook she had carried at Coronado, just with different names, different faces, different languages. But the mission remained constant. Find the threat, document the pattern, wait for the moment, then move. The work was isolating. She could not form real relationships because they would compromise her cover. She could not show her true capabilities because that would draw attention. She had to be perfectly average in every way, which required constant calculation. How much effort to show during physical training, how to respond to social overtures without seeming too friendly or too distant, how to ask questions that gathered information without revealing that she was gathering it. Every moment was performance. Every interaction was calculated. And the weight of it accumulated day by day, hour by hour, until she could feel it pressing down on her like physical mass. But she had learned to carry that weight. It was part of the job, part of who she had become. Rivers Galloway no longer existed. Marin Codreanu existed in her place, a construct built from language patterns and cultural knowledge and carefully practiced mannerisms. And when this mission ended, Marin would disappear too, replaced by someone else. Another name, another identity, another ghost moving through the world, invisible and essential. One morning, 3 weeks into her deployment, she witnessed Ionescu corner Dragomir near the equipment shed. It was early, before formation, when most recruits were still getting ready. Rivers had been returning from her morning run, the one she took alone before anyone else was awake, when she heard voices. She paused at the corner of the building, out of sight but close enough to hear. "You are slowing us down," Ionescu was saying. His voice was low and threatening. "Every time you fail, it makes the whole unit look weak." "I am trying," Dragomir said. His voice shook. "I just need more time. There is no more time. You do not belong here. You should quit before you get someone killed." Rivers had heard this before. The same words, different language. She recognized the pattern of isolation and psychological pressure. Ionescu was building towards something. This was just the beginning. Soon it would escalate to equipment sabotage or physical intimidation. And, eventually, if left unchecked, it would result in an accident that was not really an accident. She stepped around the corner, making her footsteps audible. Ionescu and Dragomir separated immediately, both of them trying to look casual. Rivers walked past them without making eye contact, heading toward the barracks. But she had seen enough. Dragomir's face had been pale, his hands trembling. Ionescu had been leaning in, using his physical size to intimidate. The dynamic was clear. That night, she added new entries to her notebook. Ionescu had moved from verbal harassment to direct threats. Dragomir was showing signs of psychological breakdown. The timeline was accelerating. She would need to gather more evidence, but she could already see how this would end. Either she would expose the pattern before someone died, or she would have to break cover again to prevent it. She preferred the former, but she was prepared for the latter. The weeks continued. Rivers, as Marin, moved through the training with mechanical precision. She completed every task adequately, but not exceptionally. She spoke when spoken to, but initiated few conversations. She blended into the mass of struggling recruits, just another face in formation, just another body on the obstacle course. And all the while, she watched. She documented. She waited. Ionescu's behavior escalated exactly as she had predicted. The verbal harassment became more frequent and more vicious. He began tampering with Dragomir's equipment in small ways. A loosened strap here, a frayed rope there. Nothing obviously wrong, but enough to create failures during critical moments. And each failure gave Ionescu ammunition for more psychological pressure. You see, you cannot even maintain your own gear. You are going to get people killed. Dragomir was breaking. Rivers could see it in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the increasing isolation as other recruits avoided being associated with someone Ionescu had marked as weak. It was the same spiral she had seen before, the same pattern that had killed. 3 men at Coronado, and she was not going to let it happen again. She began positioning herself strategically, always nearby when Ionescu was working on Dragomir, always within earshot during the harassment, always watching in a way that was careful not to be obvious. She gathered evidence methodically, building a case that would be airtight when she finally revealed it. Because this time, she wanted to finish the mission without breaking cover. This time, she wanted to be the invisible guardian, the silent protector who solved the problem without anyone knowing she had been there. But she also knew that might not be possible. Ionescu was accelerating faster than Bulldog had. He was more reckless, more confident, more willing to take risks. And that meant the moment of decision would come sooner. The moment when she would have to choose between maintaining her cover and preventing a death. And when that moment came, she already knew what her choice would be. She had made it before in the pit at Coronado. She would make it again here if necessary. Because that was who she was, not Rivers Galloway, not Marin Codrianu, not any of the names or identities she had worn over the years. She was the person who chose lives over missions, who chose protection over operational success, who carried the weight of impossible decisions and lived with the consequences because someone had to. That was the real person beneath all the masks. That was Cypher, and Cypher did not let people die to maintain cover, not when she could prevent it. Back in California, trainee Polk graduated Hell Week. So did Loomis. So did most of the class that had remained after the arrests. They stood on the beach at dawn, covered in sand and salt, exhausted beyond anything they had experienced before. Their bodies were broken, their minds were numb, but they had survived. They had made it through the crucible that separated those who wanted to be SEALs from those who actually could be. Chief Harlow walked the line, shaking hands, offering quiet congratulations. His face showed nothing, but his eyes held a measure of satisfaction. This class had been tested in ways that went beyond the normal physical and mental challenges. They had faced betrayal within their own ranks. They had learned that the real enemy was not always external, and they had survived that knowledge without breaking. That meant something. When Harlow reached Polk, he paused. "You made it," he said. "Yes, Chief," Polk replied. His voice was hoarse from days of shouting and salt water. "Do you know why?" Polk thought about it. He thought about the long nights when he had wanted to quit. The moments when the pain had been so overwhelming that continuing seemed impossible. The times when the only thing that kept him going was the memory of Rivers in the pit, calm and controlled, doing what needed to be done without hesitation. "Because I did not quit," he said finally. Harlow shook his head. "Because you learned what matters. You stopped trying to prove you were the toughest and started trying to be part of the team. That is what Cypher taught you, whether you realize it or not." Polk nodded slowly. He did realize it. Rivers had shown them all what real strength looked like. Not the loud, aggressive dominance that Bulldog had embodied, but the quiet, patient protection that required no recognition and expected no reward. That was the standard Polk would carry forward. That was the lesson he would never forget. "I wish I could thank her," he said quietly. Harlow smiled, just slightly. "She does not need thanks. She just needs you to remember. Remember that the quiet ones are often the strongest. Remember that real strength protects. It does not dominate. Remember that the people who never ask for recognition are usually the ones who deserve it most." He moved on down the line. Polk stood there in the sand, the sun rising behind him, warming his salt-crusted skin. He made himself a promise in that moment. He would remember. He would carry Rivers' lesson into every mission, every deployment, every moment when he had the choice between protecting someone or proving himself. He would choose the team, always, because that was what she had done. That was what Cypher had taught him without ever saying a word. The days that followed were a blur of recovery and continued training. The class moved forward into the next phase of Bud S. Their numbers reduced, but their commitment strengthened. They had been forged by more than physical hardship. They had been shaped by the knowledge that their actions mattered, that their choices could save lives or end them. That was a weight they would carry for the rest of their careers. Loomis found Polk one afternoon during a break in training. They sat together on a low wall overlooking the ocean, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The silence was comfortable, born of shared experience and mutual understanding. Finally, Loomis broke the silence. "Do you think about her? About what she did?" "Every day," Polk said. "Me too," Loomis said. "I keep wondering why she chose to expose herself. She could have found another way, could have reported it through official channels, could have maintained her cover and let the system handle it." Polk shook his head. "The system failed the first 3 guys. She knew it would fail you too. So, she made a different choice. She chose me over her mission," Loomis said softly. "Someone she barely knew. Someone who had never done anything for her. That is what makes her different," Polk said. "She does not calculate worth based on what someone has done for her. She calculates it based on what she can prevent. And she decided your life was worth more than her cover." They sat in silence again, watching the sun track across the sky. Somewhere out there, Rivers was doing it again. Watching over people who did not know they needed watching, protecting lives in silence. Being the guardian, no one would ever thank, because they would never know she existed. That was her burden. That was her choice. And it was a choice she made every day, in every mission, in every moment, when she could have walked away, but chose to stay. In Bucharest, Rivers sat in the cramped barracks late at night, her notebook open in front of her. The other recruits were asleep, exhausted from the day's training. She wrote by the dim light of a small flashlight, documenting another incident between Ionescu and Dragomir. The pattern was clear now. The evidence was building. Soon she would have enough to trigger an investigation without revealing her role. Soon she could fade back into the background and let the system handle it. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But plans changed. She had learned that at Coronado. Sometimes the mission required improvisation. Sometimes you had to sacrifice invisibility for impact. Sometimes the only way to stop a threat was to expose yourself to it. She was prepared for that if necessary, but she hoped it would not be. She was tired of being seen, tired of carrying names that were not hers, tired of the weight that came with every broken cover and every life saved. She closed the notebook and tucked it under her pillow. Outside, the Romanian night was cold and clear. Stars spread across the sky in patterns older than nations, older than wars, older than any of the human concerns that drove people to hurt each other. She looked at them through the small window beside her bunk and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Just a moment. Then she closed her eyes and began the process of becoming Marin Codreanu, completely. By morning, Rivers would be buried so deep that even she would struggle to find her. That was the job. That was the price. And she paid it willingly because someone had to. Because the quiet ones needed protection. Because the predators needed to be stopped. Because silence was not weakness. It was strategy. It was patience. It was the space between breaths where decisions were made and lives were saved. And in that silence, Rivers lived. Not happily, not comfortably, but purposefully. And for her, that was enough. The world continued turning. Trainees graduated or washed out. Investigations concluded or expanded. Networks were dismantled or evolved. And through it all, in the spaces between official reports and public acknowledgments, operators like rivers moved quietly through the dark. They did not ask for recognition. They did not expect gratitude. They just did the work, protected the vulnerable, stopped the threats, and then disappeared, ready for the next mission, the next cover, the next name. If you have ever known someone who worked without recognition, who protected others without asking for anything in return, who carried weight that no one else could see, take a moment to honor them. The world is full of people like that. People who do the hard things in silence. People who sacrifice their own comfort, their own identity, their own recognition so that others can be safe. They do not do it for glory. They do it because it needs to be done. And that is the truest form of strength, not the kind that demands to be seen, but the kind that works best when it is invisible. If this story reminded you of someone like that, or if it made you think differently about strength and silence, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about the quiet guardians in your life, the people who protected you when you did not know you needed protection, the ones who carried burdens without complaint and expected nothing in return. They deserve to be remembered, even if they would never ask for it themselves. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you think there is value in honoring the people who work in silence, then consider staying for more. Because there are always more stories, more quiet heroes, more battles fought in the spaces between recognition and necessity. More people who choose to be invisible so that others can be safe. And every single one of them deserves to be acknowledged, even if only in stories like this one. Even if only in the quiet moments when we remember that strength is not always loud, that power is not always visible, and that the people who protect us most are often the ones we never see coming.